Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the issues that I see that we're engaging in here, and what I see has emerged from the applications that have come in. I do want to thank everyone for being here and agreeing to participate in the Institute. We're very delighted that you all applied and it all agreed to come. I think we're very pleased that everyone we invited actually decided to come, and it was really very, very pleasing. We had a large number of great applications, and we couldn't accept a number of very good proposals. Yours were the ones that really stood out as the most interesting, the ones that most directly addressed the Institute's concerns and conceptual frameworks, the ones we thought would promote the richest range of discussions, and the ones that we thought would fit into the edited volume that we expect will come out of this. And I think that's going to be a major focus of this Institute, is working towards this edited volume here, and that will be something that's constantly coming up in the discussions over the next 7 weeks. Many of you have been addressing issues of sexual science longer than Veronica and I have. I actually came to this subject fairly recently, about 2 to 3 years ago, when I was working on an entirely different subject, and that was advertising in Western Indian newspapers between World War I and World War II. But in the course of this research, I kept stumbling across advertisements for sex tonics, the equivalents of Viagra in the Indian context, and you should all have a picture of some of the ones that I found. But these ads were ubiquitous, and it's toward the very end of this period that I was looking at that a new kind of type of ads emerged that focused on the value of the product to producing a happy marriage. And for the first time, you saw pictures of women in the ads, and the ads were clearly alluding to the sexual pleasure of women, which were absent in the earlier ads that I was exploring. And as I analyzed these ads and why they emerged in the 30s and 40s, I became convinced that it had to do with the dissemination of ideas of sexual science in India in the 1930s. As people became aware of the works of people like Havelock Ellis and Marie Stopes, as people like Magnus Hirschfeld and Margaret Sanger actually passed through Bombay in trips around India that were well publicized, and as people became exposed to the work of Indian sexologists like A.P. Pillai, who will be a major subject of Sanjam Ahluwalia's talk, and R.D. Curvey, who Shrikant Botre and I will be discussing in our paper. So I felt these ads were clearly related to the advent of sexual science. This handout actually has pictures on both sides, so I could get two images on one here. But there are a host of other very interesting ads. But in the course of writing up my article, one stumbling block I kept encountering is that some of the books I wanted were out of the library, and I thought this very strange. So who's going to be working on sexual science in India in the 1920s? And that's when I discovered Veronica was working on the travels of Magnus Hirschfeld in India during roughly the same time period that I was working on, and we knew each other well from other contexts before that, so it was not the first time we met. But we started our conversations about sex science in India, and we started thinking about the possibility of applying for a Leslie Center Humanities Institute grant. And I'm sure that was Veronica's idea because I didn't know anything about the process before that. And we definitely want to thank the Leslie Center for its support and the support of Adrian Randolph, who was the director of the Leslie Center at the time that we applied, as well as Colleen Boggs, who is the current director of the Leslie Center, for supporting our idea and helping us to secure the funding necessary. We also want to thank the Monteriki network for funding one of the fellows here, Ishita. So that it ended up being additional funding that we could use. And of course, we want to thank Isabel Weatherden for all the logistical support that she has been providing as the administrator of the Leslie Center. Now, what we understand by global sexual science in this institute has actually gone through some evolution. It's been shaped as much by the proposals that have come in as by our original conception. We mean much more by this term than just the presence of sexual science outside of Europe and North America. That's an important consideration here. And it seems to me that there are kind of 3 or 4 major groupings of papers, of themes that we'll be addressing here, and concepts of what the global means. First, the Institute is going to be focusing on the movement of people and texts on a global scale and the networks that developed among scholars and advocates of sexual science. Sexual science was truly a global phenomenon. Participants in it thought of themselves as being involved in a global community, a very high great percentage of the time. Sometimes they thought of themselves as being as much a part of these circuits as they thought of themselves being participants in their own national communities, much to our surprise. Many of the leading advocates of sexual science, like Margaret Sanger, Edith Howe Martin, Hirschfeld, saw travel and the dissemination of their ideas as central aspects of their participation in this field. And they approached this often with a missionary zeal, pursuing these issues, not just in their home countries, but all around the world. And I went down to the Sanger archives at Smith and was very surprised at the huge amount of material in the archives on Sanger's activities outside the United States. And she traveled in the 30s and then in the early 50s on several occasions. There was actually a great deal of Japanese material in the archives as well. There was a file for about 60 or 70 different countries in the world. She didn't travel to all of those countries, but these were people in communication with her in these countries. So, sexual scientists living in exile from their home countries, like Max Marcuse in Israel, Agnes Smedley in India, were crucial agents of the development of sexual science. Sexual scientists formed international networks that link them to sexual scientists all over the world. This network that I'm most familiar with now after reading Sundham's work is the network that crystallized around the journal, the International Journal of Sexology, right? And the figure A.P. Pillai, who was in contact with sexologists all over the world, and who was submitting articles to him, and he was publishing stuff on all different parts of the world. Finally, and maybe even the most significantly, there was the movement of texts, the writings of Havelock Ellis, Marie Stopes. Is it Marignon?
Yes.
How is it pronounced?
Marignon.
Okay. Hirschfeld, others that were taken up in these various countries that we'll be looking at. And these issues of mobility, exile, networks, the circulation of texts and ideas of people are issues that scholars who look at global history have recently really begun to address in works on a whole range of subjects. So we're joining a kind of approach to history that is just now really becoming significant over the last 10 years. A second kind of issue that comes up in the papers in this institute is the appropriation, mobilization, and transformation of the ideas of sexual science in particular contexts, national contexts, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where these concepts were mobilized in accordance with themes and issues that were relevant in those particular societies. While sexual science was really international in its scope, sexual science becomes embedded in the politics of particular societies, where it often served particular interests in those contexts. It becomes embroiled in intellectual debates that were going on in these societies. In the process, sexual science becomes transformed, obviously, by the usages that are made of it in these different contexts. Sexual science, we'll see, contributed to the legitimating ideologies of colonial rule in some cases, to imperial dominance. In others, it engages with various nationalist movements, sometimes in a kind of confrontational way. So we'll be looking at how Gandhi was really fighting against sexual science in some of his work. In a large number of cases, it was very central to the constitution of modernity in ways I think that have not really been appreciated in the general literature in the field. It was rarely ignored in a whole wide range of cases, and that is something I think that our sessions will highlight. Often, sexual scientists in these various countries made their own original contributions to this field. So sexual science we can think of as a kind of multi-centered phenomena that was being generated in a variety of places rather than just issuing from Europe and North America and being disseminated through the world. So that's a second theme. A third theme that I think is a particularly interesting one, and maybe one we didn't anticipate at the beginning, was the formation of the ways in which the formation of European and North American sexual science was informed by thinking about Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I think this is a particularly fresh subject. So sexual scientists in Europe were rarely just self-referential in referring just to the European context. They also often thought of themselves as men and women with a truly international perspective. And they were involved in the accumulation of knowledge about Asia, Africa, and Latin America, about sexual practices and sexual concepts in these societies. Similarly, thinking about race informed sexual science. It was a central element in the thinking of many of the founding figures in the field. So just as ideas of sexual science in Europe were being appropriated by exponents in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, there was a reverse flow of ideas that perhaps has been less openly acknowledged and was less openly acknowledged by the sexual scientists themselves from what you might say from the periphery, to use that term in quotes, to the sexual science of the metropole. So flows were going both ways. Now there's a fourth kind of conception of the global that I think may be unique to Pablo's work and where we're going to start with, and that's looking at, and forgive me if I misconstrue this, but looking at sexual science in a comparative way, but in the context of global social and economic changes. And I don't want to steal your thunder here, so we'll let you represent your work, but my sense is that your work is really reinforcing this view of sexual science as a multi-centered phenomena emerging in a global theater of social, economic, and cultural transformations. And there may be other ways that we think of the global as we go along. These are themes that really have occurred to me in considering these applications. There may be others that emerge in discussions here in the Institute sessions and also in conversations that we have on an informal basis outside the sessions, over drinks and over lunch and meals and so on. I hope we don't achieve too much notoriety for the various indiscreet subjects we discuss in various commercial establishments around town. Shrikant and I have, start talking about our subjects, and then suddenly we say, "Oh, shh, we've got to calm this down, or switch to the use of Indian terminology, or something like that as we going. So this is probably all I should say about the general framework that I see possibly informing what we're doing, the various kinds of themes.